Hey there, interwebs, and welcome back to How Fascinating. Because producing one episode a week is a bit much for my sanity, I decided to dial it down to once a month, but this month you're getting two. That's because today is a special day. Today is Inauguration Day, and I want to talk about presidents. In a previous episode, we discussed how President Taft never got stuck in a bathtub, and when I was researching the rumors and gossip for that episode, I discovered that numerous people seemed to believe that his full name was Howard Taft. It wasn't. Taft's first name was William, and Howard was his middle name. And that's what this episode is going to be all about. Presidential middle names. It's a bit oddly specific, I know, but in case you haven't noticed, this whole series frequently veers into the esoteric. Let's start out with an easy one. What was Ulysses Grant's middle name? How about just the middle initial? If you said S, you're mistaken. Sort of. Grant's middle initial was U, because Ulysses was his middle name. No, his full name was not Ulysses Grant. He was born Hiram Ulysses Grant, but was better known by his middle name since childhood. I actually have not one but two friends who do the same. So, if Ulysses was his middle name, then where did the S come from, and what did it stand for? It turns out that Grant didn't acquire the S until he was nearly an adult. At the age of 17, he required a nomination for entry into the United States Military Academy at West Point, and he acquired it from his state representative, Thomas Hamer. Hamer, however, had never met Hiram Grant before and basically screwed up the forms, referring to the young man as U.S. Grant. One source, published 4.5 decades later, claims that the erroneous S stood for Sidney, but another alleges that it came from his mother's maiden name, Simpson. You may be more familiar with the latter, that's the one used in the Animaniacs President's song, but Grant himself insisted that the S never stood for anything. Nevertheless, he adopted the name Ulysses S. Grant upon graduation. Strangely, U.S. Grant would not be the only U.S. president with the middle initial S, which stood for both nothing and two different names simultaneously. 68 years after Grant left the office, the position of POTUS would be filled by Harry S. Truman. His middle initial, or rather his full middle name, is just S. It isn't short for any longer name, but it does pay homage to both of his grandfathers, Anderson Shipp Truman and Solomon Young. Also, Harry isn't short for Harold in this case. He was named after his maternal uncle, Harrison Harry Young. Hiram Ulysses Grant also wasn't the only president to be known by his middle name, but he was the first. This trend would be continued by Stephen Grover Cleveland, Thomas Woodrow Wilson, and John Calvin Coolidge. The latter's immediate predecessor was Warren G. Harding, and the G stood for Gamaliel. It's Hebrew for reward or recompense of God, and according to Abrahamic mythology, the original Gamaliel, or OG if you will, was Gamaliel the Elder, a biblical rabbi. I'm also 80% sure Gamaliel was the elf who reforged Narsil into Anduril. I have seen it claimed that our nation's fifth president, James Monroe, was the first to have a middle name, and that it was Spence, but this is a misconception. James Spence Monroe was President Monroe's son, who died when he was only 16 months old, and whose middle name was the first name of James's father, Spence Monroe. James also had a brother of the same name, Spence Monroe Jr. Confusing enough for you? The fact is, nearly 2/5 of all U.S. presidents had no middle name. These were George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, Van as part of the surname before you say anything, John Tyler, Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, Benjamin Harrison, William McKinley, and Theodore Roosevelt Jr. That's a total of 17 out of 45. Yes, I said 45. Side note. Many people have already called Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. the nation's 46th president, and that's essentially true. But he's not the 46th person to be president. He's only the 45th. This is because almost all presidents to have served more than one term have served them consecutively, and it gets counted as a single presidency. Grover Cleveland, however, served 2 non-consecutive terms, so he is credited as the 22nd and 24th president of the United States. That's where the extra one comes from. The first president to actually have a middle name was Monroe's immediate successor, and I'm nearly certain you know what it was. That man was John Quincy Adams. He received his middle name in honor of his maternal great-grandfather, who was also named John Quincy, and without it he'd easily be confused for his father, our nation's second president. In order to distinguish himself, John Quincy Adams would come to refer to himself as JQA, see also LBJ and JFK. The next president to have a middle name after Adams the Younger was Love POTUS No. 9, William Henry Harrison, whose sole claim to fame is that he gave the longest inaugural address in our nation's history, followed by its shortest presidency, and the former is believed to have directly caused the latter. To cut a long story short, something which Harrison himself clearly never learned to do, he chose to forego the closed carriage which had been offered to him and rode a horse to his inauguration ceremony in the frigid wind and rain of early March. Then, for reasons that I'm sure made sense to him at the time, Billy Henry Harry neglected to wear an overcoat or hat while delivering an 8,500-word speech which lasted for 2 hours. The funny part is that this was the version which had been edited down for length. It was less funny when he died of pneumonia 1 month later. Perhaps the greatest irony, though, has nothing to do with the length of his speech or his presidency, but the fact that the treatments for his ailment may have only hastened his demise, 1840s medicine being what it was. Some of these ministrations included bloodletting and having him drink a boiled mixture of crude oil and Virginia snake root, which, FYI, is remarkably toxic. It should come as no surprise, then, that he didn't pull through, becoming the first president to die in office. His grandson, Benjamin No Middle Name Harrison, did a bit better, becoming the 23rd president in 1889 and living long enough to lose the 1892 election to Grover Cleveland, the man he himself had supplanted 4 years prior, despite losing the popular vote. That's right, Benjamin Harrison only served 1 term and never even won the popular vote. Why does that sound so familiar? Additional fun fact: Theodore and Franklin Delano Roosevelt were 5th cousins, and the Adams and the Bushes were father-son duos, but the Harrisons are America's only grandfather-grandson presidential duo. Speaking of presidential grandsons, Harrison the Elder's successor, John Middle Nameless Tyler, has been dubbed the accidental president due to his precursor's untimely demise, and until relatively recently, he still had 2 living grandsons. Sadly, Lyon Gardner Tyler Jr. passed away in September of last year, but Harrison Ruffin Tyler is still with us. Our 3rd trinymous president and 11th overall was James K. Polk, and although you rarely hear his name sans middle initial, you mightn't know that the K stood for his mother's maiden name, Knox, as in Fort, not School of Hard. This same middle name would also be given to the eldest daughter of his successor, Zachary the space-intentionally left blank Taylor, which led to her being nicknamed Knoxie Taylor. K is also rumored to be the middle initial of Franklin Pierce, but no official documents support this claim. It's possible that there's been some confusion with his brother, Benjamin Kendrick Pierce, who was named for their mother, Anna Kendrick. No, not that one. Both Rutherford Burchard Hayes and Ronald Wilson Reagan would also use their mother's maiden names as their middle names, and Millard Fillmore was named for his mother as well, but he had no middle name. His mother was Phoebe Millard. This means his entire name was just his parents' last names put together, and I suddenly feel better about my hyphenated surname. Also, shout out to Sophia Burchard, who raised young Rutherford and his older siblings largely on her own, since he was a posthumous child and she never remarried. Anyone who saw the previous episode will hopefully remember that the term refers to a child born after the father's death. Such was also the case for Andrew Old Hickory Jackson and Bill Clinton, something I didn't know about the latter until I began research for this video. Bill was born William Jefferson Blythe III. He only acquired the surname Clinton after his mother remarried, and that's probably for the best, since his biological father was still married to his 3rd wife when he married his 4th, Bill's mother, making the marriage illegal. The Clinton presidency was flanked on both sides by George Bush, but unlike Grover Cleveland, these were 2 different Bushes. First came George Herbert Walker Bush, and more recently was George Walker or W. Bush. Another president frequently mentioned with middle initial is Chester A. Arthur, who took office after his predecessor and Hayes' successor, James Abram Garfield, was assassinated just over 6 months into his first term. Arthur's first name came from Chester Abel, the family physician who helped to deliver him, but his middle name, Allen, paid homage to his paternal grandfather. Now, raise your hand if you remember the 2008 election. Do you remember how Obama's rivals tried to claim that he was born in Kenya and thus ineligible to become president? That strategy isn't new. Chester A. Arthur was born in Fairfield, Vermont in 1829, and due to his father's outspoken abolitionist beliefs, the family had to move around quite a lot. These frequent moves later caused trouble during the 1880 election, when Arthur's political opponents tried to spread rumors that he was secretly born in another country, first Ireland, then Canada. As you can tell, it didn't work. Also, when Obama was first elected, I found myself wondering how he'd come to be known in common parlance. Would he be referred to by his last name, like Washington, his first name, like Honest Abe, his entire name, Barack Hussein Obama, like John Quincy Adams, an entirely distinct nickname, like Ike Eisenhower, just his initials, like FDR, or just his middle initial, like W? Spoiler alert, it was the first one. I'd like to pause here to point something out. You may not consider 1876 to 1901 to be a particularly notable period of American history, but if you just look at the presidency during that time, it is absolutely wacky. This was a relatively short 25-year period that saw 9 different presidencies. Even if each of them only lasted 1 term, that should still take 36 years, or at least 34, since it starts near the end of Grant's tenure. Let's look at it blow by blow. The year is 1876. Grant is approaching the end of his 2nd term, and he shocks everyone by declining to run for a 3rd. Remember, this was before presidential term limits. Congressman James Blaine emerges as the frontrunner for the Republican nomination, but it goes to Rutherford B. Hayes instead. His Democratic opponent is Samuel J. Tilden, and the election is an absolute shitfight. On November 11th, 3 days after Election Day, Tilden has 184 electoral votes and needs 185 to win. Hayes has 166, and the 19 votes of Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina are still up in the air due to election fraud committed by both parties. The next 4 months are filled with scandals, attempted bribery, and shady backroom deals, but on March 2, 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes wins the presidency by 1 vote. He then keeps a campaign promise by refusing to run for re-election in 1880, so the Republican nomination goes to James Garfield, who wins but gets shot 6 months into his first term, making him the 4th president to die in office and the 2nd to be assassinated. Chester A. Arthur finishes out the term but won't run for another, so now James Blaine finally gets the Republican nomination, only to be defeated by Democrat Grover Cleveland. When Cleveland runs for re-election in 1888, he wins the popular vote but loses the Electoral College to Benjamin Harrison, grandson of William Henry Harrison, the 1st president to die in office. When 1892 rolls around, Cleveland takes the presidency back from Harrison, becoming the 1st president to win the popular vote thrice in a row, which wouldn't happen again until FDR, and the only one to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. In 1896, he declines to run for a 3rd term, leaving the nomination open for William Jennings Bryan, who loses to William McKinley 46% to 51% by popular vote. The 1900 election would again see Bryan run against McKinley and lose once more by nearly the same amount. This time, however, Teddy Roosevelt is McKinley's running mate. You see, due to his ruffling of feathers as governor of New York, state Republican leaders pressured McKinley into accepting TR as his VP, since the vice presidency is a trivial and powerless office that would remove Roosevelt from state-level politics. This plan backfires in 1901, when less than a year after his re-election, McKinley is assassinated by wannabe anarchist Leon Czolgosz, and Theodore Roosevelt suddenly becomes the most powerful man in the country. And that is what I call the Chief of State Shuffle. McKinley's assassination also made Roosevelt the youngest person to ever become president, although John Fitzgerald Kennedy was the youngest elected, as well as the onlyest Catholic. The other Roosevelt, FDR, was nowhere close to the youngest president, but he was by far the longest serving. After defeating the Republican incumbent Herbert Clark Hoover in a 1932 landslide, he won re-election for a 2nd, 3rd, and 4th term. Basically, America kept electing the guy until he died in office in 1945. Franklin D. Roosevelt was followed by Harry S. Truman, then Dwight D. Eisenhower, whose middle name came from his father, David. His parents originally named him David Dwight Eisenhower, but decided to go with Dwight David Eisenhower instead, on the grounds that having 2 Davids around the house would get confusing. That much makes sense. What makes much less sense is that Dwight and his 5 brothers all used the same nickname, Ike. This is generally presumed to be an abbreviation of their last name, but no one, including the family members, are quite sure how it got started. To distinguish between Ikes, each one had an adjective attached. Dwight was Ugly Ike, and there was also Big Ike, Little Ike, Red Ike, and Scoop, the youngest brother, who was also known as Ike until he decided to go into journalism. By the time of World War II, Dwight was the only one still going by Ike, and I'm sure he was glad to finally ditch the modifier. After Eisenhower came JFK, then LBJ, and Lyndon Baines Johnson was followed by Richard Milhous Nixon. Alright, next question. What's the one thing that everyone knows about Gerald Ford? He was the only U.S. president to never be elected to the office. But that's false. John Tyler, Millard Fillmore, Andrew Johnson, and Chester A. Arthur were all single-term presidents who took office following the death of their predecessor. What sets Ford apart is that the others were all elected to the position of vice president. Ford was only appointed to the position by Nixon after Spiro Agnew resigned in disgrace. 9 months later, Nixon was on the brink of impeachment and resigned too, becoming the first president to do so. This made Ford the only person to serve as both vice president and president without being elected to either office. He then lost re-election in 1976 to Jimmy Carter, full name James Earl Carter Jr., making his 895-day-long presidency the shortest of any president who did not die in office, and the rest is history, or at the very least, pub trivia. There is another interesting factlet about Gerald Ford, however, and it obviously relates to his middle name, otherwise I wouldn't have brought it up. Or rather, maybe I should say middle names, plural. Or maybe not. You see, Ford had 2 middle names, and 2 first names, and 2 last names, but never more than one at the same time. He was born in 1913 as Leslie Lynch King, Jr., but his mother separated from his father, Leslie Lynch King, Sr., just 16 days after he was born, and the two were divorced in December of that year. She remarried in February of 1917, this time to Gerald Rudolph Ford, and although she started calling her son Gerald Ford Jr. almost immediately, he was never formally adopted and didn't legally change his name until December 3, 1935, nearly 20 years later. When he did, he also adopted the conventional spelling, Rudolph, whereas his stepfather spelled it with a double F at the end. One final Fordian fun fact, he's also the only U.S. president to have achieved the rank of Eagle Scout. And that's everyone. Those are the middle names of every person to ever be president of the United States. Yep, definitely not forgetting anyone. Oh, fine. Dishonorable mention goes to Donald John Trump. Andrew Johnson was the first president to be impeached, Nixon resigned before it could happen, Bush lost the popular vote in 2000, and Ford never got elected in the first place, but Trump's the only person to be impeached and lose the popular vote twice. Each. Congratulations, you colossal ass clown. Thanks for watching, and have a fascinating day.